Hey guys, tonight we're opening a door that has been locked for over 100 years. You think you know this story. You grew up with it. You carried those little paperback books home from the library, read them by flashlight under your covers, maybe watched the show on Sunday nights with your mother and grandmother sitting on the same couch. Laura Ingalls Wilder, America's sweetheart of the prairie. The little girl with the dark braids and the boundless spirit, running barefoot through golden grass while Pa played the fiddle and everything was hard but somehow beautiful. But tonight, you're not meeting that Laura. Tonight you're meeting the real one. The one who was 15 years old, alone in a stranger's house 12 miles from home in the dead of a Dakota winter, listening to a woman on the other side of a thin wall threaten her husband with a knife. The one who taught school for wages she handed straight to her family because there was no other option. The one who fell in love with a man 10 years her senior, who drove a sleigh through blizzard conditions just to bring her home on weekends, and who she watched with the careful eyes of a woman who had already learned that what a man does tells you everything, and what he says tells you almost nothing. This is the story that came before the tragedy, and the tragedy is coming. You will feel it gathering behind every scene like storm clouds on a Dakota horizon. But first, you need to understand who these two people actually were, what they actually wanted, and why the love story they built together was nothing like the one they later described. Drop your city and your local time in the comments. Tell me if you already knew any of this, or if tonight is the first time someone has told you the whole truth. Get comfortable, turn the lights down if you want, and stay with me, because what happened to Laura Ingalls and Almanzo Wilder between 1882 and 1889 is one of the most human, most heartbreaking, and most quietly devastating stories the American frontier ever produced, and they spent 60 years trying to make sure you would never hear it. You're standing on a dirt road 12 miles south of De Smet, Dakota territory. It is December of 1882. The air smells like frozen iron and distance, the kind of cold that settles into the bones not gradually but all at once, the way grief does. There is nothing in any direction except flat white land and a sky so large it feels like a physical weight pressing down on your chest. You are 15 years old. You have a teaching certificate that technically required you to be 16, obtained through whatever combination of connections and frontier leniency allowed such things. You have a small trunk of belongings. You have a teaching position at the Brewster School, which pays $20 a month, and you need every single cent of it because your family in De Smet needs the money, and there is no one else to provide it. Your sister Mary went blind 3 years ago. Your father is working the land and the railroad and whatever else the territory will give him. You are the eldest able-bodied daughter. The responsibility of that sits on you like a harness. The Brewster family boards you. That arrangement, which sounded functional from a distance, reveals itself in the first night to be something considerably less than that. Mrs. Brewster is not well. Not in the way that people in 1882 called not well, with lowered voices and careful expressions, meaning something dark and undiagnosable. She resents her situation, resents the Dakota territory that brought her here, resents her husband, and makes no particular effort to conceal any of it. There is a night, not long into Laura's stay, when Mrs. Brewster stands at the edge of the sleeping area, and the glint of something metal catches the firelight, and Mr. Brewster's voice goes very, very quiet. Laura lies still in her corner of that house and breathes slowly and thinks about the $20 a month and the week until Friday. Because on Friday someone comes for her. She did not ask him to come. She did not even know his name well when he first appeared, Almanzo Wilder. He was 25, possibly 26. He had a homestead claim and a tree claim north of De Smet, potentially 320 acres if both proved up successfully. He had Morgan horses, which were the finest working horses in Kingsbury County, and he drove them with the ease of someone who had trained them from colts. He was known across the settlement as a man who finished what he started. 2 winters before, during the long winter that nearly starved De Smet to death, a younger version of him had driven a sleigh through whiteout blizzard conditions to bring wheat from a distant claim to the starving town. People did not forget that, and every Friday, without fail, that man appeared at the Brewster School door with a cutter sleigh and a pair of Morgan horses and the quiet, unstated offer to drive Laura home to De Smet for the weekend, She got in the sleigh. She was not sure at first why he was coming. She suspected he was interested in her friend. She watched him carefully during those long drives, the way a woman who has been formed by hardship watches everyone, cataloguing small details, filing them away. What did he say, and what did he not say? What did he do when the horses spooked? How did he handle the cold? Did he complain? Did he exaggerate? Did he make promises he had no intention of keeping? He did none of those things. He drove. He asked occasionally about her week. He returned her to her family on Sunday and drove back alone into the dark. He did this every weekend for the entire term. Not once did he ask for anything in return. Not once did he mention it as a favour owed or a debt incurred. You need to understand what that meant to a 15-year-old girl who had spent her childhood watching her father move the family from state to state chasing the next promise of better land, watching her mother pack and unpack the same small collection of treasured objects and never once complain, watching what happened to women who were entirely dependent on men who were well-intentioned but perpetually wrong about the horizon. That man drove through a Dakota winter every Friday to bring her home, and he never once made her feel like she owed him for it. The courtship that followed was not what the books would later make it sound like. It was not soft or romantic in the way that word gets used. It was careful, it was mutual, and it was, underneath the sleigh rides and the Sunday evening drives and the singing school and the buggy rides through summer fields, fundamentally a negotiation between two people who are both watching the other very closely and asking the same practical question in different ways. Can you be trusted? Laura had reasons to ask this. Her father, Charles Ingalls, whom she loved with a ferocity that never dimmed, was nonetheless a man who had moved his family 17 times across 6 states in pursuit of land that rarely delivered what it promised. He was not reckless. He was not unkind. He was, by any fair assessment, a man trying his absolute best under conditions designed to defeat men who tried their best. But Laura had grown up watching that pattern, and she had internalized something from it that she never stated in any letter or diary, but that shows in every decision she made during the courtship years. She was not going to marry a man she had not evaluated thoroughly. Almanzo had his own reasons to watch carefully. He needed a wife in the practical sense that a frontier homestead needed a wife, which is to say he needed someone to manage the domestic side of an agricultural operation, tend the garden and the poultry, preserve the food, manage the household and be a working partner in the business of surviving on the Dakota plains. But he was also looking for something beyond that. He was looking for someone who would not break. He had seen what the territory did to women who were not built for it. He had watched neighbours' wives fold under the isolation, the weather, the relentlessness. He had been watching the prairie long enough to know what it required. She taught 3 terms over those courtship years: the Brewster School in the winter of 1882 to 1883, the Perry School near her family's homestead in the fall of 1883, the Wilkins School northwest of De Smet in the fall of 1884. She handed her wages to her family, maintained her own education, and continued seeing Almanzo on weekends with the particular, unhurried patience of someone who has decided to take her time and means it. By the spring of 1885, the courtship had reached the point where the community of De Smet, all approximately 500 people of it, understood what was happening. Almanzo proposed. Laura accepted. But there was a condition. And before I tell you what that condition was, I want to pause here for just a moment, because this is one of the most remarkable things any bride did in the entire 1880s, and I want you to actually think about it before I tell you the answer. Look at your screen right now. There is one word, one single word, that Laura Ingalls flatly refused to say in her wedding vows. Every other bride in America said it without question. It was printed right there in the ceremony. Expected, assumed. Not negotiable for most women of that era. But Laura told Reverend Brown she would not say it. And she meant it. Take a look at option 1 and option 2 on your screen. Think about what you already know about Laura Ingalls Wilder, the woman who chose a black dress because white turns the colour of defeat on a farm, the woman who drove 60 miles through a Dakota winter without complaint, the woman who handed her wages to her family and never asked for credit. Think about who she was and make your choice. The answer is option 1. She refused to say, obey. This moment, which the books record and the historians have analysed and the scholars have debated for decades, was not a dramatic scene. It was not a confrontation. Laura stated it plainly. She could not make a promise she had no intention of keeping. The word obey in a marriage vow implied a surrender of judgment that she was not willing to make. If the vow required her to act against her own better judgment, she would not say that vow. Almanzo looked at her, and he said essentially that he agreed, that no decent man actually wanted his wife's obedience, that it was a word in a ceremony that nobody meant, that he had no interest in a wife who obeyed rather than a partner who thought. This was not a common position for a man in 1885 Dakota Territory. They found a minister who agreed, Reverend Edward Brown, who personally believed the word was theologically indefensible in a Christian marriage, and who had apparently been waiting for a couple willing to ask him to leave it out. On August 25th, 1885, at 10:30 in the morning, in the Reverend's own home in De Smet, Laura Ingalls and Almanzo Wilder were married. The witnesses were Ida Brown and Elmer McConnell. The dress was black cashmere that Laura had sewn herself, chosen because black could be worn again, and white turns the colour of defeat on a farm. That detail tells you everything about who she was. No party, no dancing, no white dress, no vow of obedience. Two people who had watched each other for 3 years and decided, with clear eyes and practical hearts, that they could trust each other with the full weight of a life. They moved that same day to Almanzo's tree claim house north of De Smet, and the clock started. The first year, by the honest standards of a Dakota homestead in 1885, was almost good. Almanzo's tree claim was a proper piece of land, 160 acres under the Timber Culture Act, which required him to plant and maintain trees across 40 of those acres, prove up over the required years, and the land would legally be his. He also held a homestead claim, 320 acres total, if he could prove both. By frontier standards, this was ambition with a realistic foundation. Laura settled into the work. The domestic labour of a frontier household in the 1880s was not leisure punctuated by chores. It was relentless physical production. Everything the household consumed, someone made. Bread, preserved vegetables, soap, clothing, candles. The garden was not decorative, it was structural. The chickens were not pets. The work began before sunrise and continued until there was no light left to see by, and it repeated the next morning without exception. She was 18 years old. She did it without complaint, at least in any record that survived. Rose was born on December the 5th, 1886. She arrived healthy and loud and already at 2 days old, carrying the future inside her in ways none of them could yet understand. Laura was 19, in a one-room claim shanty, in a Dakota December, with a wood stove that burned money they did not have much of, and a wind outside that sounded like something ancient and angry pressing against the walls. But Almanzo was working. The first wheat harvest had come in adequately. The horses were strong. There were evenings in that first year and into the second, when the lamplight caught the three of them just right. Laura with her mending, Almanzo with his ledger, baby Rose asleep in her corner. And it felt almost exactly like the life the books would later describe. Earned, simple, real. It was real. It just was not going to last. Because underneath the warmth, underneath the lamplight, and underneath the particular optimism of two capable people who had chosen each other carefully and were working hard and believed that was enough, the Dakota Territory was already doing what the Dakota Territory did. It was gathering itself. And what it was gathering itself for was not something that hard work or careful choices or love could stop. The Dakota Territory had a particular way of teaching lessons. It did not lecture. It did not warn. It simply changed, and you either adapted fast enough or you didn't. And the lesson it was preparing for Laura and Almanzo Wilder in the spring of 1887 was one that no amount of hard work, good character, or love could have prevented. Because the disaster that was coming for them wasn't a punishment. It wasn't bad luck in the way people use that word. As if fate had singled them out for extra misery. What was coming was a climate cycle. It was physics. It was the Great Plains simply returning to what it had always been, once the temporary wet years ended. the way a river returns to its banks after a flood. Indifferent, unstoppable, and absolutely ruthless to anyone who had been told it was something else, because that was the lie at the centre of everything. You need to understand something about the land Almanzo and thousands of men like him had staked their entire futures on. When the Chicago and Northwestern Railway pushed its tracks into De Smet in 1880, it did not come quietly. It came with promotional materials. It came with pamphlets that used the phrase Garden of Eden to describe semi-arid grassland that received, in an average year, somewhere between 15 and 20 inches of rainfall. It came with agents who travelled east and told immigrant families and young men with ambition that the Dakota Territory was waiting for them, that the soil was rich, that the land was generous, that a man with grit and willingness to work could carve something permanent out of the prairie. The railroad needed settlers because settlers meant freight, and freight meant revenue, and revenue was the point. So they sold a story, and the story was helped enormously by something that had nothing to do with the railroad at all. The settlers arrived during a wet cycle. Between 1878 and 1886, the Great Plains experienced what climatologists now call a pluvial period, years of above-average rainfall, i.e. when 18 to 20 inches fell regularly and wheat grew tall, and the land seemed to genuinely be what the pamphlets promised. Homesteaders ploughed and planted and watched their crops come in, and told themselves this was the new normal. There was even a phrase for it. Rain follows the plough. The idea, promoted by agricultural boosters and believed with surprising sincerity by people who should have known better, was that the very act of breaking and farming the prairie soil caused rainfall to increase, that cultivation attracted moisture from the atmosphere in some beneficent exchange between human effort and divine reward. It was, in the bluntest possible terms, not true. The rain had nothing to do with the plough. The rain came because of a natural atmospheric cycle that had been running on its own schedule for centuries before any homesteader arrived, and would continue running on that schedule after every last one of them was gone. And in 1887, the cycle shifted. The La Niña weather pattern settled into the Pacific. The rainfall that had been generous began to thin. What had been 18 inches became 14. What had been 14 became 12. And 12 inches of annual rainfall on the Dakota Plains, growing wheat that required at least 15 to survive, was not farming. It was a slow way of watching money disappear into dry ground. Almanzo planted in the spring of 1887 with $200 worth of seed. $200 he almost certainly borrowed, because that is how homestead farming worked. You borrowed against the next harvest to plant the current one, and you hoped the harvest was sufficient to pay the loan and leave something over, and you did it again the following year, always one season behind, always one bad yield away from the edge. The summer of 1887 was dry. The wheat heads came in thin and pale and wrong. The harvest that fall brought in $144 in gross revenue against $200 in seed costs. A net loss of $56 before you counted food, fuel, equipment, and the simple cost of staying alive through a Dakota winter. For the first time since their wedding day, the arithmetic on Almanzo's ledger did not merely show modest gains. It showed a clear line moving in the wrong direction. And thus, Laura watched him work those numbers at the table one evening and said nothing. She'd grown up watching her father work numbers that never quite came right. She recognized the silence that followed. Here is what it actually meant, in the physical reality of day-to-day life on the tree claim, to enter a debt spiral on the Dakota frontier in 1887. It meant the wood supply was calculated down to the last gourd before winter. It meant the preserved food from the garden was rationed, not eaten freely. It meant Rose, now 1 year old, was healthy and demanding and completely unaware of any of this, which was both the greatest relief and the sharpest kind of ache. A child's cheerful obliviousness to the catastrophe building quietly in the adults around her. It meant the conversations between Laura and Almanzo that had always had a forward motion, plans and projections, and the confident language of people who believed they were building toward something, began to take on a different quality. Less forward, more lateral, less next year we'll, and more if next year. Almanzo replanted in the spring of 1888. He had no real choice. He was a farmer. The farm was what they had. And there was still reasonable hope. One dry year did not mean permanent drought, and every homesteader on the Dakota Plains was telling himself the same thing that spring, planting into ground that was drier than it should have been, and listening very hard for thunder that was slow in coming. Laura was pregnant again by that winter. Their second child was due in the summer of 1888, and on the surface, this should have been uncomplicated good news, a growing family, evidence of a future worth building. But pregnancy in February 1888 on an under-resourced homestead, with a farm already in debt, meant a body that needed more than it was getting. More rest than the work allowed, more food than the pantry comfortably held. It meant vulnerability at the worst possible moment, and that was before the diphtheria arrived. It came the way disease always comes on the frontier, quietly, door to door, carried by hands that had touched the wrong thing at the wrong moment, passed between people whose isolation gave them exactly the wrong combination of closeness and ignorance about what was moving between them. Corynebacterium diphtheria. That is the organism's name. In February of 1888, it had no name that any Dakota settler would have recognized. What they knew was the symptoms. The sore throat that appeared first, unremarkable. The kind of thing you'd dismiss as a winter cold if you could afford to dismiss things. Then the fever. Then the grey-white membrane that built itself across the back of the throat and the airways, thick and sticky and extraordinarily dangerous. In children, this membrane could suffocate within hours. In adults, the progression was slower, but the toxins the bacteria released into the bloodstream were equally indiscriminate. They travelled. They looked for nerves. Both Laura and Almanzo contracted diphtheria in February 1888. Rose, 14 months old, was sent immediately to stay with Laura's parents, the Ingalls, in De Smet proper. The quarantine was the right call, the only call, really. No one wanted to watch a toddler succumb to a membrane across her throat in a house where both parents were already fighting their own fevers. Laura's case, by the grace of whatever determines these things, was relatively mild. She was sick. She was weak. She ran a fever that left her exhausted for weeks. But she recovered. Her body processed the infection and let her stand back up, shaken and thinner, but fundamentally intact. Almanzo's body did not make the same bargain. His case was severe. The fever climbed higher and stayed longer. The membrane in his throat was thick. For days the outcome was genuinely uncertain. Not in a dramatic, obvious way, but in the quiet, terrifying way of frontier illness, where there was no hospital to go to and no specialist to call, and the doctor who visited could offer nothing more than rest and fluids, and the same grim uncertainty the patient already felt. Almanzo survived the acute phase. His fever broke. He appeared to everyone, including himself, to be recovering. And here is where the diphtheria showed exactly how cruel it was willing to be. The bacterial toxins released during the acute infection had been travelling through Almanzo's bloodstream while he fought the fever. They had been searching for peripheral nerves, the long complex network of fibres that carried signals from the brain down the spine and out to the limbs. The toxins found them, and they began, without any outward sign, to destroy them. Not all at once, not in a way that anyone could see or treat or stop. Gradually. The way a rope frays from the inside before it snaps. Almanzo got up from his sickbed in late March or early April of 1888, because that is what a farmer does when planting season arrives. The fields needed ploughing, the horses needed working, the debt from last year needed a good harvest to address, and a good harvest required the ploughing to happen now, in this narrow window of spring, regardless of whether his legs felt entirely steady beneath him. He went to the fields, and somewhere out there, on the cold Dakota ground, between the horses and the plough and the particular stubborn refusal to let the land beat him, his legs gave way. The doctor who examined him used the language of 1888, a slight stroke of paralysis brought on by overexertion too soon after the diphtheria, what we now call diphtheritic polyneuropathy, a post-infectious complication in which the bacterial toxins attack the peripheral nervous system, causing paralysis that typically affects the legs first, that appears 2 to 12 weeks after the initial infection, and that in severe cases like Almanzo's does not fully reverse. His nerves had been damaged during the acute phase. His premature return to heavy labour had interrupted what limited healing might have occurred, and the damage that had been trying to slowly repair itself calcified instead into something permanent. He was 30 years old. He would walk with a cane for the next 61 years. What happened next is one of the most quietly remarkable things in this entire story. And it is remarkable precisely because it was never called remarkable by anyone who lived through it. It was simply what happened. It was what had to happen, and the woman it happened to did it without writing about how it felt until half a century later, and even then she wrote around the edges of it rather than directly at the centre. Laura Ingalls. Wilder was 21 years old. She was recovering from her own diphtheria illness. She was pregnant, and her husband, the man who had driven Morgan horses through blizzards, who had ploughed fields since he was a boy, whose entire physical identity had been built around strength and capacity and the ability to do what the land required, could no longer stand up without help. So she put on her boots and went out to the fields herself. She ploughed, she planted, she tended the livestock and hauled the water and chopped the wood. She did the work of a full-grown man while carrying a child and recovering from a bacterial infection and managing a household on next to nothing. The Timber Culture Act's requirement that trees be planted and maintained across 40 acres of the claim did not pause because the farmer was disabled. The wheat did not plant itself because the farmer's wife was pregnant. The debt did not hold while the family sorted out this new reality. Laura's hands bled from the plough handles. The research outline documenting this period notes specifically the physical toll. Hands scarred, body strained, pregnancy complicated by overwork. She did it. She did it with the particular quiet fury of a woman who has run out of any other option. And in the evenings she came back inside and took off her boots, set the boots by the door and sat at the table with Almanzo, and said very little about how any of it felt. The wheat she planted that spring and tended through the summer of 1888 actually grew. Despite everything, the disabled farmer, the pregnant wife doing double labour, the debt and the drought of the previous year, the crop came in better than 1887. A brief, extraordinary reprieve that must have felt in those weeks of watching the grain heads fill out properly, like evidence that the worst was behind them. It was not behind them. It was in fact standing directly ahead of them, wearing the shape of a summer afternoon. Prairie fires were not unusual in Dakota Territory in 1888. The grass was dry, the wind moved constantly, a spark from any source, lightning. A passing train on the Chicago and Northwestern line, a careless neighbour, could catch and spread faster than a person could run. They moved low to the ground and consumed everything that had not been green recently, which in a drought year was almost everything. The fire that came for the Wilder property in the late summer of 1888 was not a metaphor. It was not symbolic of anything. It was a fire that burned the haystacks they had stacked for winter livestock feed, and then the barn, and then the house itself. 4 years of accumulation, furniture, clothing, the small objects that constitute a life, gone in an afternoon. The wheat crop that Laura had ploughed and planted alone was gone. The shelter they had been living in was gone. The winter feed that would have carried the horses and livestock through the cold months was gone. Nay, they had nothing. They rented a single room in De Smet. They moved into it with Almanzo's cane and Laura's grief, and Rose, who was not quite 2 years old and had no way to understand why home had changed so completely. Laura took in sewing for money. Almanzo did whatever carpentry and day labour his legs would allow. They ate what they could manage. They owed money they had no way of paying with nothing they had. And Laura was, through all of it, still pregnant. The winter of 1888 to 1889 was not the worst winter the Dakota Territory had produced, but it was the worst winter the Wilder household had ever faced. Not because of the cold outside the walls, but because of the cold inside the arithmetic. Every evening the numbers said the same thing. Every morning The plan to survive another day required something they did not have. But the baby was still coming. And somewhere in the exhausted, grief-threaded silence of that rented room in De Smet, Laura Ingalls Wilder held on to the particular hope that only a coming child can provide. The irrational, necessary, completely human conviction that new life means something, that it changes the story, that the next chapter, the one that begins with a healthy child in arms, will be the one where things finally begin to turn. She held on to that hope through the longest winter of her life. And on July 11th, 1889, the baby came. The baby came on a July afternoon. Not in a hospital. There was no hospital. Not with a doctor present at the moment he arrived. The doctor had been sent for, but the prairie does not wait on anyone's schedule. And the roads between De Smet and the rented room where Laura Ingalls Wilder had been managing her grief and her pregnancy simultaneously did not shorten themselves for urgency. Almanzo sent for help. He sent Peter running to fetch Laura's mother. He sent for the doctor, but the boy arrived before any of them. July 11th, 1889. Laura was 22 years old. The baby was large and by all outward evidence healthy. The De Smet newspaper would record his birth. He had weight to him, the physical presence of a child who had arrived ready for the world. And if you imagine the moment in that rented room, Laura exhausted from labour, Almanzo standing over her with the particular stillness of a man who has just witnessed something enormous, you might understand why for a few days everything shifted. Not back to what it had been. It could not go back to what it had been. The house had burned. The harvest was gone. The debt was still there. Quiet and patient the way debt always is, not going anywhere. Almanzo walked with a cane. They owned essentially nothing. But there was a baby. And a baby in the exhausted arithmetic of a couple who had survived diphtheria and paralysis and fire and drought, and a winter that had nearly broken them both, reconfigures everything. A baby is not a solution. Any frontier mother would have told you that plainly. A baby is, in practical terms, an additional vulnerability, another person to feed and keep warm, another way for the land to hurt you. But a baby is also the most unambiguous possible declaration that the future is worth planning for, that there is a next year, that the story is still going. Although Rose was 2.5 years old, she had a brother. Here is something worth understanding about how 19th century frontier families processed joy. They did not trust it, not as a temperamental failing, not as pessimism, but as an entirely reasonable response to the statistical reality of life in Dakota Territory in 1889. The infant mortality rate that year was 174 deaths per every 1,000 live births in the territory. Nearly 1 in 5 children did not make it past their first year. And that number was an average, which meant it concealed the true weight of what frontier families carried, that you could do everything right, that you could have a large, healthy-looking baby in July and still be standing at a small grave in August. Laura would have known this the way she knew everything else about frontier life. Not abstractly, not statistically, but personally and close. Her own brother Freddie had lived 9 months and died in 1876 when Laura was 9 years old. She had watched her mother grieve that loss in silence. She had grown up in a family that understood, without anyone having to say so directly, that the children you had were not the children you were guaranteed to keep. So when the baby came on July 11th, healthy and loud and present, there was joy. Of course there was joy. But underneath it was something watchful, something that did not fully let go of the breath it had been holding since the moment of birth, because experience had taught both Laura and Almanzo that joy on the prairie had a habit of presenting its invoice unexpectedly. They kept that watchfulness quiet. They let Rose meet her brother. They fed him, held him, did what you do in the first days of a new life when the whole household reorganizes itself around the smallest person in it. They had not yet named him. The outline of what happened next suggests the naming was still coming, still pending, still the kind of thing you did in the first weeks once you were certain enough to say a name out loud with confidence. The name never came. It began with convulsions. The medical records, to the extent that records existed at all in a rented room in a small Dakota Territory town in 1889, do not specify a precise cause. What Laura would record years later, was that her son was taken with spasms and that he died so quickly that the doctor was too late. Convulsions in a newborn in 1889 could have a range of origins: epileptic disorder, birth defect, infection, the cumulative effects of a pregnancy carried under conditions of severe physical stress and nutritional depletion. There was no treatment. There was no intervention that the medicine of 1889 could have offered, even if the doctor had arrived in time. The boy was 12 days old. He died somewhere in the last days of July 1889, in the single rented room that had become the Wilder household's entire world since the fire took everything else. He died in the same space where Laura had laboured to bring him into existence. And he died in a town where the Ingalls family, Laura's parents and sisters, were close enough to be informed quickly, close enough to grieve alongside them, close enough that Grace Ingalls, Laura's younger sister, would record in her diary. Laura's little baby boy, only a month old, died a little while ago. He looked just like Manly. He looked just like Manly. Grace wrote it down. Laura did not. And there, in the distance between Grace's diary and Laura's silence, is the whole shape of what this loss meant. The way it was too large to be put into words that could be looked at again, too close to the centre of something irreparable, to be turned into a sentence and set on a page. They buried him in the De Smet cemetery. His grave marker reads, Baby Boy Wilder, son of Almanzo and Laura, 1889. He had no first name, just baby son. As if the frontier, which had already taken so much from them, could not spare the ink for one more word. The cemetery in De Smet would eventually also hold Caroline Ingalls, Laura's mother, who would be buried nearby in 1924. So the graves of two of the most important women in Laura's story, the mother who shaped her and the grief she could never speak about, ended up in the same small Dakota ground. There is something in that proximity that feels significant, though it is the kind of significance that resists being named directly, the way the loss itself resisted being named. What did Almanzo do in the days after his son died? The historical record does not say. He walked with a cane through a town that had been their community for years, past the grain elevator that had weighed their harvests, and past the church where Reverend Brown had married them without the word obey, past the neighbours who had watched 4 years of disaster accumulate around a couple who had started out with every reasonable expectation of success. He carried the weight of being a man who could not farm, could not protect his family from the drought or the fire or the disease, and now could not protect his son from whatever had seized those small limbs on day 12 of a life that had barely started. That particular grief, the grief of a man who has failed to protect what he was supposed to protect, not through negligence, not through weakness of character, but through the blind, indifferent machinery of disease and climate and economic collapse, is not the kind that announces itself loudly. It settles. It finds a place in the body and takes up residence, and it shapes everything quietly from there. Almanzo set his jaw and said very little. That too was a form of survival. Now, here is the thing that historians found decades later, digging through letters and probate records and the correspondence of Rose Wilder Lane, the daughter who was 2.5 years old when her brother died, and who grew up to become a journalist, a novelist, and the woman who substantially shaped her mother's books. Rose did not know her brother existed until the 1950s. Let that settle for a moment. Rose Wilder Lane was born in 1886. She was present in De Smet in the summer of 1889, though too young to form coherent memories of that period. She grew up alongside her parents. She corresponded with her mother for decades. She worked closely with Laura on the Little House manuscripts over the course of years, sitting with drafts, suggesting changes, understanding the arc of her mother's life better than perhaps anyone alive. And her parents never once told her she had a brother. Not in conversation, not in a letter, not in a passing reference, not in the drafts of the first 4 years, which Laura wrote in the early 1940s and which covered the marriage years directly, including, in sparse and careful language, the birth and death of the unnamed son. Even in that manuscript, written in pencil across 3 notebooks that Laura never attempted to publish. The grief is present mostly in the spaces around the words, in what she does not say, in the brevity of the sentences describing those 12 days. Rose discovered the existence of her unnamed brother through her own historical research in the 1950s. She was in her 60s, and when she found the small grave marker in De Smet, baby boy Wilder, son of Almanzo and Laura, 1889, she was meeting a sibling she had never been allowed to know existed. 60 years of silence. Think about what that kind of silence requires. Not just the decision made once, in grief, not to speak of a dead child. That decision is understandable, even inevitable, in the immediate aftermath of loss. But the maintenance of that silence, every year, every letter, every visit, every conversation about the family, about De Smet, about those years, the discipline required to hold a grief that large and never let it surface, never let a word slip, and never allow your surviving child to know that she once had a brother who looked, according to her Aunt Grace, just like her father. That kind of silence is not forgetting. It is the opposite of forgetting. It is the most extreme form of remembering, carrying something so carefully, so deliberately, that no one else can see the weight of it. And here is the cliffhanger buried inside the silence itself, the detail that the history books tend to mention quickly and move past, but which deserves to be held for a moment. Laura Ingalls Wilder spent decades after 1889 building one of the most beloved mythologies in American literary history. She wrote books about pioneer resilience, about families that endured hardship with grace, about the frontier as a place where hard work and love and faith could carry you through. Those books were read by millions of children. They shaped how an entire generation understood the American West. And at the centre of those books, hidden in plain sight, was a gap. A 12-day life that never made it into any of them. A baby who had no name in any record that survived, who was present in Laura's body for 9 months, and in the world for less than 2 weeks, and who was then, entirely deliberately, with the full knowledge and cooperation of both his parents, erased from the public story of their family. The question that historians still debate, the question that Laura's silence makes impossible to fully answer, is this. Was the erasure of her son an act of grief too deep to share, or was it something more calculated? Was it a woman protecting herself from having to explain a loss she could not explain? Or was it a writer, with an instinct for narrative that ran below the conscious level, understanding that a dead, unnamed baby in 1889 was the one story she could not make into anything useful? She could make the drought into a lesson about resilience. She could make the paralysis into a story about partnership. She could make the fire into evidence of starting over. But a 12-day-old boy with no name who died from convulsions for reasons no one could identify, buried in ground she would never live near again, that story had no second act. It had no redemption built into it. It was just loss. Pure, structural, irreducible loss. And Laura Ingalls Wilder, who was many remarkable things, was also a woman who needed her stories to have a second act. The decision to leave Dakota Territory was made sometime in August 1889. It was not a single conversation. These things rarely are. It was more likely a series of silences that gradually accumulated into an acknowledgement, the kind that happens between two people who have been through enough together that they no longer need to say the hard thing directly, because they can both hear it in the spaces between the ordinary sentences. They could not stay. The arithmetic of that was absolute. No house. The fire had seen to that. No farm. The drought and the debt had seen to that. No healthy breadwinner capable of the heavy physical labour that plains farming required. The diphtheria had seen to that. No second child, whose very brief existence had briefly made everything feel worth continuing. The convulsions had seen to that. The creditors were patient in the way that creditors always are when they know there is nowhere to run. Almanzo relinquished his tree claim. The legal documentation of that relinquishment still exists in Kingsbury County records. A single transaction, a piece of paper, the formal surrender of land that Almanzo had filed on, worked for, planted trees on, borrowed against, and ultimately could not hold. 4 years of farming, 4 years of debt, 4 years of physical labour and hope and catastrophe, reduced to a signature on a form in a county office. He had arrived in Dakota Territory young and ambitious, with Morgan horses and muscle and the kind of confidence that comes from never having faced something you couldn't handle. He left with a cane and a wife and a daughter and a debt he couldn't pay and a son in the ground. That is not a failure of character. That is not the story of people who lacked grit or resilience or the work ethic that frontier mythology prizes above almost everything else. That is the story of two people caught in the machinery of something larger than any individual choice could have changed. A climate cycle, a bacterial epidemic, an economic system built on promises the land could not keep. But it felt like failure. It felt like it every morning when Almanzo reached for his cane. It felt like it when he looked at the legal documents relinquishing the claim. It felt like it when Laura packed the last of what they owned, which was not much, into whatever vessel would carry them forward. The plan was Spring Valley, Minnesota. Almanzo's family was there. His parents, James and Angeline Wilder, had a farm, more than 90 acres of established productive land in Fillmore County, southeastern Minnesota. A farm that had been built over decades into the kind of operation that the Wilder homestead in Dakota had never had the time or the luck to become. They had extended an invitation. They had seen the situation clearly enough over the preceding months that the invitation was as much a statement of fact as a gesture of hospitality. Come home. We have room. It was not the direction Laura had expected her life to move. You do not stand at an altar at 18 years old, watching a minister remove a single word from your vows at your own insistence. And imagine that 7 years later you will be packing what remains of your household to move into your in-laws' home. You do not marry a man known across the county for his strength and his stubbornness, and his Morgan horses, and imagine that you will watch him lower himself carefully into his father's chair, with a cane propped against the wall, while you learn how to be quiet in a kitchen that is not yours. You do not plan for any of this. But it was where they were. Here is what no one would find out for years, and what makes the departure from De Smet something more complicated than a simple story of defeat. Laura Ingalls Wilder, at 22 years old, leaving a town and a territory she had lived in for nearly a decade, why, was already beginning, somewhere below the level of conscious thought, in that place where the people who will one day write books are always, without knowing it, filing things away. To shape the story of what had happened, not to make it easier, not to pretend the disasters had not been as bad as they were, but to figure out what story the disasters were part of, what they meant, what a person was supposed to do with 4 years of accumulated catastrophe when the only way forward was to put it in a wagon and drive away from it. She would not write the books for another 40 years. She would not publish the first of them until she was 65 years old, standing on the far side of a second life built in Missouri, on different soil under different skies. Neither she would be a grandmother when she finally sat down to tell the story of the girl with braids running across the prairie. But the decision she was already making, about what to remember, about what to say and not say, about which parts of the truth served the story, and which parts would have to be held in silence. Those decisions were beginning now, in De Smet, in August 1889. Beside a small grave with no name on it, in a Dakota cemetery under a sky so wide and indifferent that it made every human grief feel simultaneously enormous and insignificant. She looked at that sky one last time. She would never fully come back to it. But it would follow her, into Spring Valley, into Missouri, into every book she wrote, into the silence she kept so completely that her own daughter never felt its shape until she was 60 years old. And there was something waiting for her in Spring Valley that she was not prepared for. Not more disaster, not more loss, something subtler and in some ways harder to survive than fire or drought or paralysis. The thing waiting for her in Spring Valley was the mirror. The clear, unflattering, inescapable mirror of arriving at a prosperous farm with nothing, and having to look at what that said about everything she and Almanzo had tried to build, every choice they had made, every promise the frontier had made and broken. That mirror was already there, sitting in Angeline Wilder's kitchen, and Laura was one wagon ride away from having to look into it. The wagon pulled into Spring Valley, Fillmore County, Minnesota, sometime in May of 1890. Laura Ingalls Wilder was 23 years old. She had $150. She had a 3-year-old daughter sitting in the back of the wagon. She had a husband on the seat beside her, who drove with both hands wrapped around the reins, and his jaw set in the particular way it set when he was carrying something he would not put into words. And she had, somewhere in the recesses of a body that had been working at maximum capacity for 4 consecutive years, a reserve of exhaustion so deep that she had long since stopped being able to feel the bottom of it. They were not moving towards something, not the way they had moved toward De Smet in 1885, young and purposeful, with land claim and seed money, and the entire open architecture of a future still unbuilt. That kind of movement has a specific feeling to it, momentum, direction, the sense that the road ahead is longer than the road behind. This movement was different. This was the movement of people who had run out of forward and were now moving in the only direction that remained available. Back toward family, back toward shelter, back toward the particular mercy of people who will feed you without requiring you to explain how you got to this point. Almanzo had sold the sheep to pay for the journey, the sheep that Laura had originally purchased with wages she had earned teaching school. Her own money, from her own labour, before the marriage, before the farm, before all of it, had become in the arithmetic of their collapse the last convertible asset they possessed. He sold them. He bought the wagon passage, and they left. The landscape changed as they moved east and north. The Dakota Plains gave way to the rolling, tree-broken hills of southeastern Minnesota, Fillmore County, where the sky is interrupted by ridgelines, and the land has a settled, inhabited quality that the open prairie deliberately refuses. Green in a way that Dakota is only briefly and tentatively green. Permanent in a way that homestead country is never permanent, because the trees here are old enough to have roots that go down past where a drought can reach. Laura would have noticed that. She noticed everything. James Mason Wilder had been building his Spring Valley operation for 20 years. He had come to Fillmore County in the early 1870s, drawn by family connections. His wife, Angeline's brother, George Day, had been one of the area's early settlers, and he had purchased land with the methodical confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and intended to keep doing it for a long time. Over successive years he bought adjoining parcels, and then, after George Day died in 1873, he purchased Day's land outright for $500. By September of 1875, when James moved the entire family from Malone, New York to Spring Valley, he arrived with more than 90 acres in multiple parcels, established buildings, livestock, and the quiet authority of a man who has planned an agricultural transition rather than escaped into one. He was 77 years old when Laura and Almanzo arrived. His farm had been running in its Spring Valley form for 15 years. Alas, stand at the edge of that property in May of 1890 and look at what you're looking at. A substantial farmhouse, an established barn, built to last, not the temporary wood and hope construction of a Dakota claim shanty, but the kind of structure that a man builds when he intends the next generation to use it too. Outbuildings, livestock, fields that have been worked long enough to have a character, a history, a relationship with the family that tends them, the kind of farm that does not shout about itself but that communicates, to anyone with eyes, that what stands here was built by someone who did not panic and did not abandon and did not lose. James and Angeline Wilder came out to meet them. There was food on the table. Of course there was food on the table. Angeline Wilder was 67 years old and had been managing households with precision and competence since before Laura was born, and in Angeline's world guests are met with food because that is what you do. Rose was pulled into her grandmother's arms. A real bed was available. The woodpile was full. The stove was running. Almanzo set his cane against the wall and sat down carefully into a chair. Laura looked around the kitchen and said nothing, but she was counting. She was always counting, always assessing, always doing the specific kind of arithmetic that her life had trained her to do. Not in numbers exactly, but in the currency of what is here versus what is needed. And what was here? in Angeline Wilder's kitchen in May of 1890, was everything that had been absent from the Wilder household for the preceding 4 years. Order. Sufficiency. The calm that comes from knowing where everything is and having enough of it. She'd been here 3 minutes and she already understood, completely and without comfort, exactly where she stood. Almanzo's father was not cruel. That needs to be said plainly. James Wilder was a Methodist, a church-going man, a patriarch of the old frontier school, who understood that a father's duty to a struggling son did not expire when the son turned 30. He opened his home without conditions. He fed the family. He asked nothing except what Almanzo's limited physical capacity could contribute to the farm's lighter operations. Animal care, equipment maintenance, the planning and observation that do not require a fully functional body, but do require the knowledge of someone who has been farming his whole life. He did not say the hard things out loud. He was too well raised, too principled for that. But here is the thing about the hard things that go unsaid. They do not disappear. They become the atmosphere. They become the particular weight of every morning silence at the breakfast table, the quality of the light in the kitchen, the sound of a father's boots crossing the yard toward fields that his son can no longer manage. James Wilder, at 77 years old, was still in command of a productive 90-acre operation. Almanzo Wilder, at 33, needed help getting through a Dakota winter. Both men knew this. Neither said it. Laura watched it from across the table every morning and filed it away in the place where she kept the things that hurt too much to look at directly. The same place where she kept the small grave in De Smet, the burned house, the $56 loss from 1887 that had been the first sound of the floor giving way beneath them. She was building something in that interior space. She did not know it yet, but she was. What the Spring Valley year actually gave Almanzo was something specific and medical, and, in its quiet way, genuinely significant. Diphtheritic polyneuropathy, the nerve damage that had collapsed his legs in the spring of 1888, is not a static condition. It can improve with time and critically with reduced physical demands. On the Dakota farm in 1888 and 1889, there had been no reduced physical demands. There had been Laura doing the field work while he tried to do whatever his legs allowed and mostly failed, and then there had been the fire, and then there had been the dead baby. And then there had been the rented room and the grinding inescapable pressure of trying to survive in a place that had decided to be done with them. In Spring Valley, the pressure was removed. Not entirely. The social and psychological pressures of dependent living in his father's house were their own particular weight. But the physical demands dropped to what his body could actually manage. Light animal care, equipment observation, work done in pieces with rest between, in a mild Minnesota climate that was gentler on damaged nerves than the brutal extremes of Dakota had been. Gradually, all over the months in Spring Valley, his legs found their new equilibrium. He would never be what he was before February 1888. That was permanent, and the cane that he had begun using in 1888 would remain in use for the remaining 60 years of his life. But his functional capacity improved. He could do more in Spring Valley after 6 months than he had been able to do in De Smet in the final year. His stamina returned, slowly, to a level that was not what it had been but was enough to plan around. And there was the barn. In James Wilder's barn, with horses that were well kept and well trained and responsive to the handling of someone who knew them, Almanzo found the one domain where his disability had the least reach. His relationship with horses had been the defining feature of his practical identity since childhood. It was in his hands. It was muscle memory so deep that the damaged nerves in his legs did not touch it. He could still stand at a horse's head and know things about that animal that most people with 2 fully functional legs could not perceive. He could still harness and drive. He could still be competent in the one arena where competence, for Almanzo Wilder, had always been most completely expressed. It was not a large thing. But in a year that did not offer large things, it mattered enormously. Laura's interior life in Spring Valley in 1890 and 1891 is almost completely invisible in the historical record. No letters from this period have been found, no diary entries, no notes. Not one written word from a woman who would go on to become one of the most widely read American authors of the 20th century. The silence in the archive is so complete, so perfectly total, that it cannot be accidental. A woman who later demonstrated across multiple decades a strong instinct for documentation and self-expression left no record whatsoever of the hardest year of her adult life. That is not an oversight. That is a decision. What we can reconstruct from the framework of what was surrounding her is the emotional texture of those months. She cooked and cleaned and sewed, the domestic labour that was both expected contribution to the household and the only available form of agency in a space she did not own and could not direct. She cared for Rose, who was 3 and then 4 years old in Spring Valley, at the age where stability is absorbed into the body rather than understood by the mind, which meant that Rose's expansion and cheerfulness in those months was both a comfort and its own complicated thing to witness, evidence that the child was thriving precisely because her parents had surrendered their independence. She attended the Spring Valley Methodist Episcopal Church every Sunday. The church records document this. 2 names in a ledger for 1890 and 1891. One of the only pieces of documentary evidence that Laura and Almanzo were in Spring Valley at all. Victorian Gothic architecture, 21 stained glass windows, a congregation of people who had known Almanzo's family since the Wilders arrived in town in 1875 and who knew, with the quiet efficiency of small-town knowledge, exactly what had happened in Dakota. She sat in those pews, she sang the hymns, she was polite and present and gave nothing away. And underneath all of it, something was shifting. It is difficult to name precisely. But there is a specific thing that happens to a person who has been in crisis for long enough, who has been moving from emergency to emergency with no time to process any of them, just forward motion and survival, and the next required task. When the emergencies finally stop, the body and mind, suddenly relieved of the imperative to simply cope, begin a slower, more complicated reckoning. With what happened, with what was lost, with what remains. Laura Ingalls Wilder, in the quiet kitchen of her in-laws' Spring Valley farmhouse in 1890, began that reckoning. Silently, without witnesses, without writing it down. There was also the question of what came next. They could not stay in Spring Valley permanently. This was obvious to everyone, though no one said it directly, which was the Spring Valley way of handling obvious things. James and Angeline Wilder were aging. The farm needed the labour of young people it would not be getting from Almanzo, at least not in the form that a 90-acre operation properly required. And Laura, whatever she had learned about making herself small in someone else's household, was not built for permanent smallness. The woman who had refused the word obey at 18 was not going to spend the rest of her life in someone else's kitchen, however generously that kitchen was offered. The question was not whether to leave Spring Valley. It was where to go and what to do when they got there. The first answer was Florida. This is the part of the story that most people don't know, the brief disorienting chapter that sits between Spring Valley and Missouri, between the family's lowest point and its eventual recovery. In 1891, Laura and Almanzo travelled to the Florida Panhandle. The medical logic was Almanzo's legs. Warmer climates were recommended for individuals recovering from neurological conditions in the 1890s, and the damp, mild air of the Deep South was understood, however imprecisely, to be better for damaged nerves than the extremes of Dakota winters. They went. They spent time there, and it did not work. The Florida climate, it turned out, was the wrong kind of warm, humid in a way that was oppressive rather than restorative. Flat in a way that offered none of the agricultural possibility either of them was capable of evaluating land without automatically doing. Neither Laura nor Almanzo was built for subtropical farming. Their entire agricultural knowledge was of temperate zone crops. Wheat, hay, the standard Great Plains and upper Midwest rotation. Florida's different soil, different growing seasons, different everything did not speak to them in a language they could work with. More than that, it did not feel like somewhere they could build. And Laura, whatever else she had never lost the capacity to recognize the difference between a place that can hold a life and a place that cannot. They came back. The decision, the real one, the one that changed everything, was made in 1894. By then, Laura and Almanzo had returned from Florida, spent additional time in the De Smet area, and arrived at a point that felt like the bottom of the search. They had been looking for 4 years since leaving Dakota for a place where 2 specific things were simultaneously available: land cheap enough for people with almost no capital to afford, and a climate moderate enough for a man with compromised legs to work in year-round, without the brutal winters that had characterized every previous location of their adult lives. The Ozark Highlands of southern Missouri met both conditions. A neighbor in De Smet, Paul Cooley, had land in Wright County, Missouri that he was willing to sell. 40 acres, 800 apple trees already planted and growing in nursery rows on the hillside. Easter not yet transferred to their permanent orchard positions, but present and alive and representing years of someone else's forward-thinking agricultural labour. The asking price was $400 total. The down payment required was $100. Laura and Almanzo had exactly $100. This is the kind of coincidence that history occasionally produces. The number that is available matching the number that is required, the gap between where you are and where you need to be exactly bridgeable by what you actually possess. And it feels, when you encounter it in the archive, almost too neat to be real. But it was real. They had $100. The farm cost $100 down. They bought it. In July of 1894, they loaded what they owned into a 2-seated hack. Laura would later write about this journey and On the Way Home, a diary she kept of the trip, and drove south and east out of Dakota toward a 40-acre hillside in Mansfield, Missouri, that neither of them had ever seen. Rose was 7 years old. Almanzo's cane was in the wagon. Laura had a small notebook in which she was writing down what she saw as the landscape changed around them. The practical daily diary of a woman crossing from the northern plains to the Ozarks with $100 and a family and the kind of forward motion she had not felt since 1885. She was writing again. The log cabin on the 40 acres was rough. Almanzo put his tools to it immediately, cutting windows into walls that had none, repairing the roof. He is making it livable through the first Missouri winter on pure determination and the particular carpentry skill that years of frontier building had given him despite the limp. Laura moved in with Rose and the minimum of furniture and did what she had always done. She made do, and she made it work, and she started counting what was here rather than what was missing. What was here, in the late summer of 1894 on a rocky Ozark hillside in Wright County, Missouri, was this: 40 acres of land with genuine timber, a climate mild enough for year-round cultivation, 800 apple trees in nursery rows waiting to be moved to their permanent positions, a husband whose body had found its new range of function and was discovering, slowly, with the particular relief of a man who has been finding the limits of what he can do, that the Missouri Ozarks were asking things of him he could actually give. The wheat farming model that had broken them in Dakota was gone. They would not plant wheat. They would build a diversified farm, the apple orchard as the centerpiece, surrounded by chickens and a kitchen garden and dairy animals, and all the varied smaller productions that, taken together, did not require any single crop to succeed in order for the family to eat. It was a different kind of farming, slower, more patient, more forgiving of the disability that was not going to stop being a disability. Almanzo could work this farm. That was not a small thing. Even after 6 years of being unable to do the essential work of the only occupation he had ever known, 6 years of watching Laura plough, of sitting in his father's chair, of assessing land in Florida that couldn't hold him, the discovery that his body and a specific piece of Missouri land were compatible, that they could negotiate with each other towards something that functioned, was the closest thing to a second chance that the story of Almanzo Wilder contains. They named the farm Rocky Ridge. Here is what the Little House books never told you, and what makes the Spring Valley year, the Florida chapter, and the $100 down payment on a Missouri hillside something more than a personal survival story. Between 40 and 60% of homesteaders in Dakota Territory abandoned their claims during the agricultural crises of the late 1880s. The Wilders were not exceptional in their failure. What they had that other collapsed homesteaders may not have had was James Wilder's farm in Spring Valley, the 90-acre safety net, the shelter during the years of recovery, the platform from which the next attempt became possible. Without Spring Valley, there is no Florida experiment. Without the Florida experiment and the years of continued searching, there is no Missouri decision. Without Missouri, there are no Little House books. The books that would eventually make Laura Ingalls Wilder one of the most beloved American writers of the 20th century grew directly out of the years she spent not writing. The Spring Valley silence. The Florida displacement. The years of rebuilding on Rocky Ridge before she had anything to say that felt ready to be said. She was 65 years old when the first Little House book was published. She had been living on the Missouri farm for nearly 40 years by then. She had been thinking about the story for all of them, and somewhere in that thinking she made the decisions that shaped everything the books became. What to include, what to leave out, what to carry in silence, what to give the world. The drought, the paralysis, the fire, the rented room, Spring Valley, Florida, the rocky hillside in Wright County. None of it appeared in the books directly. All of it was present in them, invisibly, the way the roots of an old tree are present in the ground even when you can only see the trunk. And there was still one more thing she'd never told anyone, not her readers, not her editors, not even, as far as the historical record shows, her own daughter. The question of why she wrote the books when she did, why a 65-year-old woman, after decades of silence about the hardest parts of her own history, sat down and began to write books for children about a prairie childhood. That question has an answer. But it is not the answer most people expect, and it begins not with Laura at all. It begins with Rose. There is a particular kind of woman who survives everything, and then, quietly, when the surviving is done, sits down and decides to tell a story. Not the whole story, not the truest story. A chosen story, shaped by what she needs the world to know, pruned of what she has decided the world does not need, is structured by someone who has spent 60 years watching and listening and filing things away, and now, at an age when most people are settling into the past, is finally ready to build something out of it. Laura Ingalls. Wilder was 63 years old in 1930, when she completed the manuscript she called Pioneer Girl, and handed it to her daughter Rose with something very close to hope. The manuscript was a direct account of her own life, beginning in the Wisconsin woods and moving forward through all the relocations and all the winters and all the quiet disasters that Charles Ingalls had carried his family through, with a fiddle and a stubborn faith in the next horizon. It was honest in the way that things written late in life can be honest, when there is less to protect and more to account for. It included things that the books would later leave out. It was the record of what actually happened, before anyone had decided yet what version of what actually happened was the version worth giving to the world. Rose read it. She was, by 1930, a journalist and novelist of genuine professional stature. She had travelled Europe, covered major stories, written for Harper's and Saturday Evening Post, and was living a life that would have been almost unimaginable to the woman who'd given birth to her on a December night in a Dakota claim shanty in 1886. She understood narrative. She understood markets. She understood, with the particular clarity of someone who has made a living turning raw material into sellable form, what her mother had given her. She also understood what her mother had left out. The Pioneer Girl manuscript did not sell as an adult autobiography. Rose sent it to multiple publishers through the agent Carl Brandt, and it collected rejections through 1930 and into 1931. Too episodic, not dramatic enough for the commercial market, lacking the sustained narrative arc that adult readers expected from memoir. The form was wrong for the material, but there was an editor at Harper & Brothers named Ida Louise Raymond who read Pioneer Girl and saw something different in it. What she saw was not an adult memoir. What she saw was a children's book, or rather, a series of children's books, each one focused on a specific period of Laura's childhood, each one small and contained and shaped for the young reader who would carry it home from the library and dog-ear the pages. The suggestion changed everything. Laura went back to the material. She pulled from Pioneer Girl the earliest years, the Wisconsin big woods, the log cabin, the firelight and the fiddle music and the wolves that howled outside the door, and she shaped it into something new. something tighter, warmer, more deliberate in its structure than the original manuscript had been. She wrote it as a story for children, but not a simple one. She wrote it with the craft of someone who had been thinking about narrative for a very long time, and had now found the form that fit what she needed to say. Little House in the Big Woods was published by Harper and Brothers in 1932. Laura was 65 years old. She'd been living on Rocky Ridge Farm in Mansfield, Missouri for 38 years. The book was an immediate success. Understand what 1932 meant. The Great Depression had been grinding across the United States for 3 years. Banks had failed. Farms had failed. Families who had spent decades building something found themselves watching it disappear under the weight of debts they could not pay and markets that had collapsed around them. The particular despair of that moment, the sense that the system had failed, that individual effort was not enough, that the future was not reliably available to people who deserved it, was something that Americans in 1932 felt in their bodies, in their daily lives, in the specific exhaustion of people who have been working hard and losing anyway. Into that moment, Laura Ingalls Wilder sent a book about a family that had very little and found it enough. About a father who played the fiddle on winter evenings when the snow came down heavy outside the cabin walls. About a mother who kept the household running with the precise, unhurried competence of a woman who had internalized a specific and unshakable faith that her family would be all right. The books were not about the Depression, but they were read inside it, and the readers who received them, the children who grew up during those years, the mothers who read aloud to their children at night, found in them something that the Depression was trying to take away from everyone. The sense that ordinary American lives, lived simply and with dignity, were worth commemorating, were worth recording, were more than just the sum of their disasters. This is what the books did. This is why they lasted. And Laura knew exactly what she was building. She had spent 60 years watching what stories do to people, how they shape expectations and identities, and the sense of what is possible. She had grown up in a family where her father told stories around the fire the way other men might build fences, deliberately, with intention, because the stories were a form of shelter. She understood in her bones what narrative was for. She chose, with full knowledge, what the Little House books would be. The collaboration between Laura and Rose is one of the most documented and most contested literary partnerships in American history. The documentary record of their working relationship exists in hundreds of letters, preserved at the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library and other archives, exchanged between Laura at Rocky Ridge and Rose at her various residences and travels across America and Europe. Those letters track the development of each book, the drafts that Laura sent, the revisions that Rose returned, the editorial notes that sometimes covered more of the manuscript pages than Laura's original text, the negotiations about language and tone and the specific degree of sentiment that each of them thought was appropriate for a children's audience. Rose was not, by any reasonable account, simply a copy editor. Her involvement was structural. She rewrote passages, adjusted timelines, smoothed transitions, and imposed a narrative sophistication on material that Laura had drafted in the more episodic, impressionistic style that she had developed writing farm articles for the Missouri Ruralist since approximately 1911. And the farm articles were good, practical, warm, observational, written by someone who understood agricultural life with intimate specificity and had a gift for making the particular feel universal. But they were not novels. They were not the sustained narrative arcs that a book series required. Rose provided that structure. She also provided something less visible but equally significant. She provided the framing, the interpretive frame within which the Little House books understood their own material, the emphasis on self-reliance, on individual grit, on the family that makes its own way through hard country and hard weather, was not purely Laura's creation. It was shaped, significantly, by Rose's political sensibility. By the 1930s and 1940s, Rose Wilder Lane had developed into a committed libertarian thinker. She was, with Isabel Patterson and Ayn Rand, one of the three women most closely identified with the founding of modern American libertarian conservatism, a position she would articulate most fully in her 1943 book The Discovery of Freedom. Her political convictions centered on the primacy of individual freedom, the danger of government dependency, and the belief that human progress was generated by individual enterprise rather than collective action. Those convictions are present in the Little House books, woven into the texture of how frontier life is portrayed, what is celebrated, and what is omitted. The books emphasize what individuals and families accomplish through their own effort. They minimize, systematically, consistently, the role of community support, family wealth, institutional assistance, and collective survival strategies in making frontier life livable. The Spring Valley year is not in the books. The safety net is not in the books. The 90-acre farm that caught Laura and Almanzo when they fell is not in the books. That is not only Laura's choice to protect her own privacy, it is also Rose's political vision of what the frontier meant and what story it was supposed to tell. Laura finished the Little House series in 1943 with these happy golden years. The book that ends at her wedding, at 18 years old, on August 25, 1885, with the specific and deliberate formal elegance of a narrative that has reached its conclusion. The series ends where the marriage begins. It ends in the moment before everything that followed. It ends precisely where this story started. There was one more manuscript, written sometime in the 1940s, in pencil, in 3 small notebooks that Laura kept in her desk at Rocky Ridge. She called it The First 4 Years. It covered the period from the wedding in 1885 through the death of the infant son in August of 1889, the 4 years that the Little House series had deliberately architecturally omitted. She never revised it. She never showed it to Rose for editing. She never submitted it for publication. It sat in the desk drawer through the remaining years of her life, through Almanzo's death on October 23, 1949, when he was 92 years old and had been walking with a cane for 61 years, through the 1954 establishment of the ALA's Laura Ingalls Wilder Award, named in her honour, recognising a body of work of lasting contribution to children's literature, through the last years of her own life on the farm where she and Almanzo had arrived with $100 and a family and not much else in 1894. It sat in the drawer through all of it, unfinished and unpublished and private. Laura Ingalls Wilder died on February 10th, 1957, 3 days after her 90th birthday. The notebooks were in the desk. The First 4 Years was published posthumously in 1971 without revision, in the rough draft state that Laura had left it. Scholars who encountered it for the first time were startled by its tone. Darker than the series, less resolved, carrying the specific unprocessed quality of material that had never been shaped into the form it would need to take to be shared with readers. It was the story Laura could not finish. The story that kept its raw edges because she never found a way to smooth them down without losing the truth of what they contained. Here's what that manuscript tells you, reading it alongside everything that came before it. Laura Ingalls Wilder was 2 different writers. One writer made the choice that storytellers make when they're building something for the world, the choice to shape, to select, to find the version of the truth that can be held and carried and passed from hand to hand without breaking the people who receive it. That writer gave the world 8 books and 60 years of beloved reading, and the particular kind of American myth that endures because it is made of something real, even if it is not made of the whole reality. The other writer sat in a farmhouse in Mansfield, Missouri, in the 1940s, and wrote in pencil in 3 notebooks about the 4 years she had spent trying not to die on the Dakota plains, about the wheat that kept failing, about the husband who kept getting up from the floor only to fall again, about the baby who lived 12 days, about the house that burned, about the wagon seat and the road south out of De Smet, and the long 2 days of travel towards Spring Valley, and the in-laws' charity she had been trying her whole life not to need. That writer never finished the manuscript. She could not make it into the right shape. She could not find the ending that it needed because the ending of those 4 years was not a triumphant recovery. It was a wagon trip to Minnesota and a year of someone else's food and a long, slow, no silent reconstruction of a self that had been taken apart disaster by disaster and had to be put back together in a different arrangement than the one it had started with. That is not an ending you can give a child. That is not the shape of a story that sells. So she kept it in the drawer, and she gave the world the other version. What did Almanzo make of all of it? He was not a man who left records. No known diary has ever been found. No letters in his hand from the marriage years. No memoir, no statement of purpose. No account of what it cost him to live in his father's house at 33, or to drive a wagon south out of Dakota knowing he was leaving the only thing he had spent his adult life trying to build. What he left was the farm, Rocky Ridge Farm in its final decades, and was not the 40 struggling acres they had arrived on in 1894. It had grown through Almanzo's labour, patient, deliberate, conducted at the pace that his permanently compromised legs could sustain, into a genuine agricultural operation. The apple orchard that had been 800 trees in nursery rows when they arrived was a producing orchard. The farmhouse that he built from timber, cut on their own land, had 10 rooms. The property had expanded to nearly 200 acres. The farm produced income. It produced stability. It produced the specific, quiet evidence of a man who had found the terms on which he could still do the work that was his identity, and had spent 50 years doing it. He died on October 23, 1949. He was 92 years old. He had walked with a limp for 61 of those years and had kept farming for nearly all of them. That is not a story of triumph over adversity exactly. It is something more complicated than that. It is a story of a man who discovered, after the disasters that stripped away the version of himself he had intended to be, that there was another version available, smaller in scope, different in character, conducted at a pace he could sustain rather than the pace he had originally demanded of himself, and that this version, accumulated over 5 decades on a Missouri hillside, amounted to something. Not the thing he had planned, but something. Laura, in the 8 years she lived without him after 1949, did not stop being who she was. She answered her mail, she received visitors at Rocky Ridge. She remained, in her late 80s, a woman of precise observation and unsentimental humour, the same woman who had refused the word obey in 1885 because she intended to be a partner, not a property, and who had spent the subsequent 7 decades proving that the refusal was not an abstraction but a practice. She died on February 10th, 1957. She was 90 years old. And somewhere in that death, in the leaving of a farm and a desk drawer full of penciled notebooks, and 8 published books that had been read by millions of people and had shaped the way a country understood its own founding story. There is the ending of a story that began in December of 1882, when a young man drove his Morgan horses through a Dakota winter to bring a 15-year-old schoolteacher home on a Friday afternoon. The whole of it, courtship and wedding and drought and diphtheria and dead baby and burned house and Spring Valley and Florida, and $100 and a rocky Missouri hillside and the books and the silence and the drawer. The whole of it was a life, a real one, not the one the books described, not the one the television series performed for 20 million viewers on weeknights in the 1970s. The real one, with all its disasters and all its silences and all the things she chose to carry privately, and all the things she chose to give away. The choosing, in the end, is the story. She chose. She always chose. That is what the books were about, even when they were not. Here is how the most important document in American children's literary history was found. Not in an archive. Not donated to a university library in a carefully catalogued box with conservation tissue between the pages. Not preserved by someone who understood what they were holding. It was found in a desk. In February of 1957, 3 days after Laura Ingalls Wilder died at Rocky Ridge Farm in Mansfield, Missouri, the people who came to settle her estate found 3 small notebooks in the drawer of her writing desk. The notebooks were ordinary, the kind you would buy at a general store, nothing special about the binding or the paper. They were written in pencil. The handwriting was Laura's, in the deliberate, careful script of a woman who had been writing for decades, and knew that handwriting was a form of effort worth taking seriously. The notebooks covered August of 1885 through the summer of 1889. The 4 years that Laura Ingalls Wilder had never published. The 4 years that the Little House series had architecturally excluded. The drought, the paralysis, the burned house, the 12 days of a baby boy's life. The years that had existed in all the decades of the series' publication and celebration as a gap that readers sensed but could not name. A missing chapter in the story of a woman who had told her own life so carefully and so selectively that the gap itself was almost invisible. The notebooks were the first 4 years, written sometime in the 1940s in Laura's 80s, never revised, never shown to Rose, never submitted to Harper and Brothers, never offered to the public, not in the 30-odd years between their writing and the morning someone opened the desk drawer and found them there, unpenciled and silent and exactly as she had left them. She had kept them. She had not burned them. She had not buried them in the backyard or sealed them in an envelope marked "Destroy unread." She had kept them in the drawer of the desk where she worked, which is where writers keep the things they are still thinking about. What does it mean to keep something you will never finish and never release? It means you are not ready to say it is gone. It means you are living alongside it, year after year, knowing it is there, knowing it is true, knowing it is not the right shape for the world, but not willing to pretend it does not exist. That is what Laura did with those 3 notebooks for the last decade or more of her life. She lived alongside the unfinished truth of what those 4 years had been. She got up every morning on the farm she had built from nothing. She answered her correspondence. She received her visitors and her admirers. She existed as the beloved author of books that millions of people carried in their hands and their hearts. And somewhere in the desk, in the drawer, were the notebooks that held the version of the story she had never found a way to give away. By 1949, she had been living alone at Rocky Ridge for the first time in 55 years of marriage. Almanzo Wilder died on October 23, 1949. He was 92 years old. He had walked with a cane for 61 of those years, and for most of the preceding decade his physical capacity had been limited to what the farm's immediate surroundings could provide: the porch, the yard, or the familiar geometry of a property he knew so well that the land itself had become a form of memory. He had outlived the Dakota claims and the Spring Valley year and the Florida experiment and the entire long arc of building Rocky Ridge, from 40 rocky acres to a 200-acre producing farm. He had outlived his Morgan horses and most of the people who had known him on the frontier. He had outlived, quietly and without comment, the version of himself that he had been before February of 1888. He did not leave a memoir. He did not leave letters of substance. He left the farm, which was now entirely Laura's, and the silence he had always kept about the hardest parts of what they had been through together. A silence so complete and so practiced that it had become, over 60 years, indistinguishable from peace. Laura was 82 years old when he died. She had 8 more years ahead of her, alone in the house he had built room by room from timber cut on their own land. 8 years of correspondence and visitors and the peculiar celebrity of a very old woman whose books had become something close to national scripture. 8 years of being Laura Ingalls Wilder, the author, the pioneer, the beloved myth, without Almanzo in the next room, without the particular weight of his presence that had been the constant physical fact of her adult life since August of 1885. She did not write about what those 8 years felt like, at least not in any record that survived. She answered her letters. She was kind and generous with her readers, particularly the children who wrote to her in their careful school handwriting to tell her that they loved the books and wanted to know if she still had her braids. She was, in the way of very old people who have survived enormous things and come out the other side into a kind of earned calm, essentially herself, observant, unsentimental, precise, with the particular dry humour of a woman who'd seen too much to be impressed by very much. But the notebooks were still in the desk. The year before she died, something happened that the books had not prepared anyone for. In 1954, the American Library Association established an award in her honour, the Laura Ingalls Wilder Award, given to an author or illustrator whose books had made a substantial and lasting contribution to literature for children. It was, in the formal language of professional recognition, an acknowledgement that what she had built across 8 books and 2 decades was not simply popular but enduring. Not just beloved, but significant. The kind of thing that institutions create awards to name when they are confronted with a body of work that has already become part of the culture and needs to be formally acknowledged before it can simply be assumed. Laura was 87 years old in 1954. She was too frail to travel to receive the award in person. Think about that for a moment. The woman who had driven a covered wagon out of Dakota with $100 and a family in 1894 who had ploughed fields alone at 21 years old, who had buried a baby and watched a house burn and sat in her in-laws' kitchen for a year, making herself small enough not to take up too much space. That woman was now too old to walk across a room to receive an award named after her. The body that had done all of that work had finally, at 87, arrived at its limits. She accepted the award by letter. The letter has been preserved. It is not a long letter. It is not sentimental. It is the letter of a woman who understood, clearly and without false modesty, what she had made and what it had cost to make it. She thanked the association. She said the books had been written to preserve the memory of a way of life that was already gone when she was writing about it, and she hoped they would continue to be useful to children who needed to know that the past had been real, that the people in it had been real, that the difficulties they had faced had been real, and that real people facing real difficulties had found ways through them. She did not say, and some of the ways through were other people's farms and other people's charity, and the kind of help that never appears in the books because it does not fit the story the books needed to tell. She didn't need to say it. The 3 notebooks in the desk said it for her, in pencil, silently, to no one. There is a question that has occupied scholars of the Little House series for decades, and it is not the question that most people think it is. Most people think the central question is the authorship controversy. How much did Rose actually write? Where does Laura end and Rose begin? Should the books be published under both their names? That question is real and it is genuinely unresolved and it matters, but it is not the deepest question the archive presents. The deepest question is this: what did Rose destroy? In 1968, the year of her own death, Rose Wilder Lane burned papers. This is documented. It is not speculation. Scholars who have worked in the relevant archives, the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library, which holds the Lane papers, and the various collections associated with the Wilder family, have noted the gaps, the missing correspondence, the letters referenced in existing documents that cannot be found because they no longer exist. Rose was aware, in the last years of her life, that her mother's papers and her own were going to become the subject of scholarly scrutiny. She knew what was in them. She had spent decades, after all, working with her mother's manuscripts, exchanging hundreds of letters about the book's composition, navigating the delicate and complicated terrain of a collaboration that neither of them had ever fully acknowledged as a collaboration. She chose, before she died, that certain things would not be available to the scholars. We do not know exactly what she burned. That is the nature of destroyed evidence. It is defined by its absence, by the gaps in what should be there, by the silences in a correspondence that was otherwise prolific and detailed and preserved, with the care of people who understood that what they were writing to each other was likely to matter to someone eventually. What we do know is this: the gaps cluster around the years of the most intense collaboration, the early 1930s, when the first Little House books were being drafted and revised, and the early 1940s, when these happy golden years was being completed, and when Laura was writing the notebooks that became the first 4 years. The gaps cluster, in other words, precisely around the period when the decisions were being made about what would be in the books and what would not be, whether the missing letters contain evidence of a more contested collaboration than either woman admitted to, whether they contain Rose's assessment of the first 4 years' manuscript, which Laura appears to have kept entirely separate from the editorial process, never sending it to Rose, never asking for her professional opinion, whether they contain, somewhere in the missing pages, some version of the conversation about the Spring Valley year, about the baby with no name, about the rented room and the burned house and the particular quality of their silence about all of it. We do not know. Rose burned them, and the fire took whatever was in them, and we are left reading the borders of the absence like archaeologists mapping a site by the shape of what is not there. Here is what we can say, with confidence, about what Laura chose to keep and what she chose to give away. She kept the notebooks, She kept the first 4 years in the desk drawer for the last decade or more of her life, unrevised and unpublished, close enough to touch every time she sat down to write a letter or answer a reader. She kept the truth of those 4 years in pencil in a drawer, which is as close as a writer can come to keeping something without releasing it. She gave away the series, but 8 books, published over 11 years, beginning when she was 65 and ending when she was 76. 8 books that gave the world the Laura she had decided the world should have. The girl with the braids and the sunbonnet, the daughter of the restless man with the fiddle, the prairie childhood that became, over 70 years of reading, something close to the founding myth of a particular version of American identity. The books are not lies. That is important to understand. They are selective, and selection is not the same as falsification. Every detail in them that can be checked against the historical record checks out. The wedding date, the school terms, the blizzards, the long winter, the ploughing and planting and harvesting of a life lived close to the ground. The fiddle is real. The sunbonnets are real. The love between a father and his daughters, expressed through music and stories around a fire, is as real as anything in the archive. What the books omit is also real. The baby in the Desmet Cemetery is real. The year in Spring Valley is real. The borrowed room and the burned house and the night Almanzo set his cane against someone else's wall and sat down carefully into someone else's chair. All of that is real, and none of it is in the books, and the absence is not an accident. It is a decision, made by a woman who understood what she was doing, who had been thinking about narrative for 60 years before she picked up a pen to write the series, who knew that the story she was telling was not the whole story and told it anyway, with full intention and full awareness of what she was leaving out. That is not a failure of honesty. It is the exercise of the only form of power fully available to her. The power to say, this is what I choose to share, and this is what I choose to keep, and the choosing is mine. She chose. She always chose. From the moment she refused the word obey, at 18 years old, because she intended to use her better judgment, right through to the February morning in 1957, when she died and left 3 pencil notebooks in a desk drawer for the world to find. She was always choosing. The first 4 years was published in 1971, 14 years after Laura's death. It was published without revision, in the rough draft state that Laura had left it, by Harper and Row. It had no dedication. It had no author's note. It had no framing introduction that explained why Laura had written it and never published it. Because no one alive by 1971 knew the answer to that question with certainty. Scholars have spent 50 years trying to work it out. The most honest answer is probably this. She wrote it because the 4 years needed to exist somewhere in writing, even if they could not exist in the books. She wrote it because the baby with no name deserved to be written about by his mother, even in pencil, even in a private notebook, even in a draft that would never be revised. She wrote it because Almanzo's cane and the burned house and the Spring Valley year were part of her story too, the part that the book's architecture could not hold. And she was a writer, and writers put the things they cannot let go of onto the page whether anyone will ever read them or not. She kept it in the drawer because she could not release it, and could not destroy it. It existed in the space between published and gone, the space where difficult truths live when the person who holds them is still alive and still protecting something, some version of themselves or someone they love, from the full weight of the public record. When she died, the drawer opened, and now you know what was in it. But here is the thing about Rose's fire. In 1968, somewhere in a house in Danbury, Connecticut, where Rose Wilder Lane died on October 30th at the age of 81, papers burned. The specific contents of what burned have never been conclusively established. Scholars have mapped the gaps. They have identified the missing years, the absent letters, the correspondence that should exist and does not. They have drawn their conclusions about what those missing documents likely contained, but no one has proven it. No one has opened a sealed archive and found a list of what was destroyed. No recovered letter has revealed what Rose decided the world should not see. What if the missing letters contain something that changes the story? Not the authorship question, that is settled enough, but something else. Something about the Spring Valley year that Rose knew from her parents' conversations and that Laura never wrote down anywhere except possibly in a letter she sent to her daughter sometime in the 1930s or 1940s. Something about the baby. Something about the year of silence in the archive. The year when a woman who had become one of America's great writers left no written record of her inner life at all. And what if Rose burned those letters not to protect her own reputation, or to protect her mother's carefully constructed myth, but because what they contained was something she had been asked directly, explicitly, by her mother? The woman who ploughed fields at 21 and kept 3 notebooks in a desk drawer for 30 years. To keep private. What if the silence was a request? We will never know. The fire took it, and the desk drawer is empty now, and the 3 notebooks are in the archive at the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library, preserved under controlled conditions, catalogued and cross-referenced and available to any scholar who submits the correct request form. And somewhere between the notebooks and the fire, between what Laura kept and what Rose destroyed, is the complete story of a woman, and a marriage, and a catastrophe, and a recovery that became one of the most beloved bodies of work in the history of American children's literature. You have most of it now. The rest is ash.